This should be a DoNotGod video presentation. Should be. Economics, really, just the modern mystic, just for the sake of it, old time's sake. I used to be a smart fellow, but has become just just belligerently stupid on two subjects. He doesn't understand that there's value in the universe because things can feel, and they can feel good or they can feel bad, and that makes value. And he doesn't understand anything about economics, but thinks he does. He doesn't understand what the basic, why there is such a thing as stuff called money, currency. So I've been over this before, but we'll go over it again quickly and do the briefest version I can muster or attempt, or whatever the right word is. So the world is full of things. It's full of people. Okay, I don't know what that is. And the stuff they own. So STUF. Stuff. You can have a sheep, with 6 legs and 1 head. Or you can own a house. You can own different stuff. Car, So you have you and your stuff. You is valuable because you might be inventing something, or you might be able to produce something in the future, or you might know how to do a certain thing that's useful. So you can do work. Work is valuable. So, and what an economy is that you're going to interact with other people, person over here, and now you're going to interact with somebody in another country, virtually, through some sort of magic. But anyway, point is you're going to interact with somebody else, and you want to do some exchanging. You didn't want to have to carry all your stuff with you, so you carried a deed to it, So you had a deed to your sheep, and deed to your car, deed to your house, deeds. And you could basically just go up to somebody else and just exchange the deed and just say, okay, I'm giving you possession of something. Come pick it up whenever you want, and you give me possession of some, I'll trade you my house for your car, whatever, blah, blah, blah. You're making some sort of trade. You're bartering. Instead of bartering by putting all this stuff in your pockets and carrying it over there, you're bartering by just having a piece of paper that's a contract. And the trick is that eventually the governments... you don't even need governments, you just institutions, would be called a pawn shop, and a pawn shop would basically be a bank, and the bank would say, we like this deed exchanging stuff, so you bring us stuff, deeds, we'll create a universal piece of money, so we don't have to trust each other anymore, we'll trust this authority here, and they'll create a new kind of deed. That's a deed to your deeds, so it's just a way of saying let's all have a common kind of piece of paper that can be exchanged for anything. We just put a dollar value on it and say, this is $1 worth. So if the house is $10, then you need 10 of these deed pieces of paper to buy a house from the guy. So it made the whole system nice and easy. Then the banks could even afford to borrow and lend money, and you'd give them you'd bring cash in, even deposit, and they'd give you interest on it, so they could have more paper to give out, kind of a thing. So they could lend out your wealth in terms of how many pieces of these paper you sold, how many houses you sold, so you made a whole bunch of extra deeds, and now you could put your deeds in a bank, in a vault, in a safe place, and the bank would make it grow a little bit and give you extra buck for every week that went by. So that's, you can sort of get the idea. So, but it's all based on the idea that whatever these pieces of paper are, they have to be able to go back to the actual stuff. They're a deed, they're a piece of paper representing actual stuff, something of value, a car, a house, something. All right, so the paper, the stuff that whoever's printing it makes, it has to have a direct correlation to a value. And so the original value would be you'd throw some gold in a pile, and then you'd say, we have gold certificates, or some other thing in a pile, and say, we have a pile of stuff we collected. Now we can print so much of this deed stuff because we have this pile of stuff. And again, all this stuff has to do is somebody bring in the deed to their house into the bank and take the money out. The money then is representing what's actually in the bank, real stuff, real ownership of real things. So it's just a way of doing barter. So when you see a dollar bill is really just saying a dollar's worth of value. A sheep, a piece of a wheel on the car. So it's worth something. It's tied to something. It's supposed to be tied to something. That's what gives it value, is that it's actually tied to something. You take it to the bank and you can actually get the real deed. You can get possession of the house. You can get possession of a car. You can get possession of a sheep. It's actually real value that the paper is just a representation of. And that's what money is. So money is real value represented as a piece of paper. So you can't just print it. You can't, you can, but obviously you'll just ruin your economy. So it can't, you have to be careful how you make the pieces of paper. I don't want to do that. This I can get rid of. Camera I will restore. It has some value. Yeah, somehow something went wrong. Okay, don't bring up the menu. There you go. Okay. That's the way to do it. I should make sure I'm recording, right? You probably noticed. I just didn't notice. Yeah, it's recording. Okay. I didn't get rid of that. Okay, I'll get rid of it that way. Alright, so I'll play a little bit of this, but he doesn't really go into any details, doesn't explain anything. He just says how everybody else is wrong, and his notion of it is right. And his notion is basically, don't worry, be happy. We can print as much as we want. It really doesn't matter. And so, I mean, I can show you the charts, the two charts that are really important. The other charts are important. I mean, how much debt we actually have in terms of bonds is really bad. I mean, there's a lot of it. And, you know, those bonds have to keep being reissued, and eventually we're going to have to pay interest on them. But anyway, this is the actual cash in circulation going back to 1985. And you can see this jump right here at the end. The corona jump, which isn't good, and it's going to represent inflation in the future. So this year should be more inflation than last year because of that little jump. I mean, it's a significant jump, really. I mean, it's a 10% jump, and so, but it's still only a total of $2 trillion. So in all the world, there's only $2 trillion pieces of paper that have a dollar denomination. So it's obviously a lot less than 2 trillion pieces of paper, because a lot of those bills are $1,000 bills and all that kind of stuff. But there's only that much. There's no more than that. Gotta take a break, sorry. Always something. I guess I can do it this way. Yeah, it should be back. Alright, so the cash is in pretty good shape in the sense that there's only $2 trillion of these slips of paper that say you owe me something. You have to give me something, real stuff. So $2 trillion in worth of stuff isn't any big deal. Now the chart that's really a mess is the Federal Reserve chart. That was the one. So this has to do with what the banks have in their vault. So the banks are the ones that distribute money in the sense that they do the interactions. So the $2 trillion in the economy goes into one bank, and then that bank writes a check, and then that's essentially the money's transferred. And it's in this vault, the Federal Reserve, is where the money's transferred. So when the Bank A writes a check to Bank B, the money in the Federal Reserve goes from B to A to cash the check. Well, from A to B. And so all the checks are balanced, and so it's just really a way of taking the money the government's guaranteeing, the $2 trillion, and just evening out between the banks about what they say they owe each other. Now, the trick they did was decide to tell the banks to basically write checks that were never going to be cashed to buy stuff off the market. So I've already explained this is just a gimmick. It's a way of increasing the value of the stock market, because you're essentially buying commodities off the market. So you're buying paintings. Say there's a painting auction for some paintings. The fewer paintings in the auction, the higher the prices can go. The more paintings there are, the lower prices will be. So by buying paintings off the market, you make the other stuff more valuable because there's more bidders for it. So it keeps the stock market going up, if you can find some way to take stocks essentially off the market. Take stuff rich people own off the market, and they'll have to buy what's left over. So there's 8 trillion now, almost, in bad checks. In checks they just haven't cashed. So Bank A wrote a check, okay, and bought a bond off of somebody. That person took the check, cashed it at a bank for $1 billion or whatever, and they never squared the checks in the Federal Reserve. So the checks are still sitting in the Federal Reserve, and they've never been settled. They never moved the actual cash because they can't cash the checks. And it's $8 trillion. You understand why they can't cash them, because it's 8 times as much cash that's in circulation. They can't cash these checks because it's 8 times the amount of cash in existence. And it's uneven. One bank has most of all of it, and all the rest of the banks don't have any of these bad checks. So anyway, so they're just playing the game of trying to get away with a way of maintaining a sound economy when it's very unsound. They didn't want the stock market to drop, because the stock market drops, the whole economy slows down, blah, 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 blah. So they had to boost it up this fake way. And they also needed to borrow money because, they gave tax cuts to the rich and didn't get any money coming in, so they had to pay the bills. And they didn't have any money to pay the bills, and they can't issue bonds because nobody wants to buy one because it doesn't pay any interest. So they're stuck with with just very unsound economics. So to fix the old crisis in 2011, the housing crisis, they fixed it by guaranteeing a bunch of junk bonds in the market. People lost all their money. They couldn't allow them to lose their money, so they made good on their losses by just guaranteeing stuff that's garbage. And so that ruined FDIC insurance. So there's no FDIC insurance. And this means that as soon as the banks go bankrupt and say, I need the cash, they're going to force the government to say, okay, we'll cash the checks. And if they cash the checks, that means that currency number is going to go who knows where. So just remember, there's 2 trillion in currency. There's 8 trillion in the Federal Reserve. 8 trillion. If the banks say, I need the money, and they start turning those bad checks into actual currency, that means you're going to have to print currency. This number to go down, this number is going to end up going up and up and up and up. And as you print currency, you dilute the value of all the other currency. So if I go out right now, if I burn a $10 bill, I'm making all of you richer, because I just turned all your money, I just made your money incrementally a little more valuable, because I destroyed competing currency. So now your currency has more value. And the exact opposite happens. You make more currency, okay, then you're bidding things up, you're overpaying for them, because now you have more bidding currency in the auction, so to speak. The more money you give the buyers, okay, the higher the prices go. So it's hugely inflationary to print currency. Now that's been proven every single time, because every single time a country's done it, they've had, like Japan's yen, 1 million yen is $1. Huge inflation, right? Germany ruined over it. All the South American countries, insane inflation. So you can't print cash. As soon as you start printing cash, as soon as this Federal Reserve money goes back and goes out into circulation, and the only other choice is the government has to actually take in tax revenue, and instead of spending it on, health care, or coronavirus vaccines or this or that or the other thing, and it has to spend it to pay back its debt, to buy stuff back, to put stuff back on the market, essentially, to release the bonds it bought. And the negative side, it has 2 negative sides. First, you're taking tax revenue to buy something that won't be a service, that won't do anybody any good. And second, the process means you're putting another bond back on the market, which means you're diluting the stocks again. You're making the stock market go down for 2 reasons. First, because you're taking money in for taxes, and you're not spending it on anything that's consumptive. And second, you're diluting the stocks with the very same process. So paying this back, putting this $8 trillion, fixing this bad budget is going to be extremely caustic to the stock market. Just as doing it was really good for the stock market, undoing it's going to be really bad for the stock market. And so how are they going to do that? Who's going to do that? Who's going to have the courage to crash the market, okay, to fix this problem? Nobody. And this is the thing the mystic totally ignores because he doesn't pay any attention. He thinks cash has something to do with paper. No, it has to do with currency. How much currency, how many claims that are direct government claims to money, to stuff, versus bank claims to stuff. And the two things aren't the same. And the paper doesn't mean just paper. It means a real statement, a note, a real note. And there's a difference between a real note and something that's not a note. And there's certainly something different between an uncashed check, okay, and cash. Those are really different things. And he doesn't pay any attention to those simple rules. And so he doesn't understand anything about this economics. He doesn't understand why from his philosophy, I guess we could just keep printing cash and there's no problem. Just flood the market with cash. The government needs to pay some bills. Don't tax. Just print cash. Cash. Just let the cash to the Social Security. Cash for this. Cash for that. Let's buy everybody free education. Let's give everybody everything with free cash that we just print. And he doesn't think that's going to create insane inflation, which is really dumb of him. Now, of course, he does think that. He does know that. But he's pretending somehow that's not a real factor of the economy. And somehow, just because we are in such a huge deflationary trend, that it would be impossible to create inflation. Well, you'll see it this year, and you'll see it as that number of that, as that number goes up of how much printed cash there is, how much cash there is in the economy, and how much of it has been just created by the government, not because of economic activity, but because of desperation, because they just can't pay their bills, so they're going to print money. You'll see it. The effects are going to be real because it's a real effect. You're diluting everybody else's money. There's just no doubt about it. When they print money that doesn't have a sheep or a car or a house tied to it, okay, that dilutes the money. All right. That's the simple concept, and it's all needs to be understood. It's all this stuff has to be tied to something real. And the whole point is all of it is tied to something unreal. The stock market says you have a piece of stock and it says it's worth $100, but it's only worth $10 in assets. So it's not really worth $100. It's really worth $5 in real assets, maybe $4, maybe $2. Right? So it's way overvalued. All right, and all of that, when the stock market starts to crash, all of that gets realized as everybody who thought they were really rich isn't really rich at all, because everything they think they have as assets, the real value, when push comes to shove, okay, is 10% or 5% or 4% or 2% of what they thought it was. They'll take their deed, their stock certificate in, and it says 100 on it, and they're only going to get 3. And that's going to be a huge problem. And the bigger problem being even that there's a huge amount of rich people who have so much wealth that it wouldn't even matter if they got 1% back, because 1% is going to be a huge amount of money. And when they take that big pile of money out of the pool of money, there's not going to be any left for you. All right. So there's no FDIC insurance. $7 trillion of liabilities. They got $100 billion in assets. No way to ever cover it. Just a minute. All right, back again. All right, so I just want to emphasize that this chart, okay, this bottom line is where the real assets of the bank would be. The rest of it is just these checks the banks wrote that there was no intention that they ever be cashed. So they just bought things they didn't have the money for at the government's bidding. And the agreement is the checks don't leave the Federal Reserve. That is, the cash can't leave the Federal Reserve. But clearly that can't work if the banks are under stress because they wrote the check. It's a liability on their books. These aren't assets the banks see. Under normal conditions, this line being huge like this would mean the banks were hugely wealthy. Had $8 trillion in assets and all this stuff. That's not what it means. They have $8 trillion in assets they never paid for. So it's $8 trillion in liabilities. And again, the liabilities are against the federal government because these are the worst kind of liabilities. This is a liability to put bonds on the market. $8 trillion worth of bonds they took off the market, they'd have to put back on the market. It's a huge dilution of what can be bought on the market. It's like adding another 1,000 paintings to an auction for 400 paintings, and you put on 4,000 paintings on top of it. It's a huge dilution of the market. All right, makes them even harder to sell is the point, which means the government has to pay a higher and higher rate to sell them because they're so unsellable. So the liabilities just keep going up and up and up and up. So I'm just saying this, you know, for him to pretend this is good or fun or rational economics, no, it's completely irrational. It can't make any sense to anybody who thinks they want a sustainable system. This is a pyramid scheme. Like I said, there's no way to fix this without crashing the market. Absolutely no way. There's no way they can collect the $8 trillion from taxpayers to pay down this problem, and that still puts them just $40 trillion in debt still. I mean, that still means they have all the bonds. They already have the bond problem, so they already have a bunch of unsellable bonds, and this is going to just make it even worse. So that problem is going to get even worse. And again, if they crash the market, they have even less revenue coming in for taxes. You know, not that it matters too much, because they've made it so nice for the rich people in terms of their tax rates, you know, that it almost doesn't matter anymore. But anyway, huge, and he pretends it's not a problem.
Right. Let's see if we can try and catch some people up, and I'll try and move on a bit from where we're at.
None of that happens.
So we're on CBDCs. Central bank digital currencies.
Right. So central bank digital currency doesn't mean anything. It's just another way of representing the same dollar. The dollar still has to be somewhere. You don't create new dollars to create digital dollars. They're still the same real dollars. You just leave a dollar in a vault somewhere instead of actually having the dollar move around. But it still has to represent a real dollar, and the real dollar still has to represent real stuff. Okay, so you know, pawn tickets wouldn't mean anything if I could take a pawn ticket for a TV. I take in a TV and I have a pawn ticket for it, and then I made 600 copies of the TV pawn ticket and then sent out to 600 TVs. Obviously, it's not going to work, because then 600 people show up saying, "Give me a TV," and I only got one TV. The currency is the currency, whether you have it in a digital form, whether I draw a picture of it and say, look, it's in my back room, here's a picture of my thing I own. It doesn't make any difference. It still has to represent something that's real. So a digital digit is still a real currency digit. It's still a real claim on a real something, some piece of dollar that has a serial number on it.
Where we've established that what we're basically on now is PBDCs, private bank digital currencies.
So again, just doesn't make a private bank just means checks. So instead of just saying checks and certificates, now they're going to say digital certificates and digital checks. Who cares? They still have to be part of the accounting. They're still part of the process. And the fact that the bank is writing checks when it doesn't have the assets would be a real problem. If it goes out and buys something and something falls apart and breaks and doesn't work, and it bought it with just writing a check, but it doesn't have any cash, well, then it's going to have a real problem. It's going to be bankrupt.
That we call bank deposits, and we've noted that bank deposits aren't bank deposits at all. They are always in the legal possession of the bank. They come.
So there's just more nonsense, okay? It's still your claim is your claim, and it'll be held up in court, okay? If you have a claim and the bank wrote you a check, and the check says the bank owes you money, it owes you money. So it's just silly to say it's only, the bank still owns the money. No, it doesn't own the money, okay? It has possession of it, but its possession is clearly only exists based on certain circumstances and has every obligation to give me back the money. Okay, unless it's going to claim bankruptcy or some other kind of weasel out of the debt somehow. It has to weasel out of the contract with some circumstance that justifies weaseling out of the contract. So it's just silly to say it's the bank's money. It's not really the bank's money. As long as I have a bank book saying I have a certain amount of money and I'm entitled to it, all I have to do is prove that, and it's my money. So he's making this implication that this means something. This doesn't mean anything. This is just baby talk around the edges of the truth. The truth is, no, you put your money in the bank. It's just a fact. You put in the stuff that you have a legitimate claim to in a bank. All right? And the bank is obligated to give you back your stuff when you ask them to.
On your bank statement as yours, but that's just fluff if it comes to shove.
If it comes to shove, that's the whole point. The whole point is that when it's supposed to come to shove, the federal government is supposed to be insuring your assets. But they don't have anything in the insurance fund. So there's no crisis. They're not going to be able to insure a small wind, let alone a hurricane. So if the big crash happens and people need their assets, FDIC ain't going to help you any. It's going to say, come back 2 months from now when we've printed a whole bunch of cash and inflation has made your money useless. So come back when I can give you $10 instead of $100. I'll give you $100, but they'll only be worth 10. Yeah. I'll pay you when I can pay you nothing. So wait till there's 100% inflation so I don't have to pay you anything.
As in, it ever goes to court, it is always found that those deposits are always belonging.
So that's the bullshit. No, I'm sorry. No. Whenever it goes to court, those deposits are the person who has a legitimate claim to them. It's just nonsense to say they belong to the bank. They do not belong to the bank. That is just a lie. Silly. Never happened in an American court where American court said, oh, you put your money in the bank? Oh, it's the bank's money now. You can't have it. Never happened, crazy fuck.
To the bank. They're the banks. And at a push, it could be said that you lend them to the bank, but it makes no difference, really.
Oh, yeah, it makes a huge fucking difference. You have a fucking receipt. It makes a huge fucking difference. Yeah, I can't go into a bank and say, the money in the vault's mine. How do I prove it? Oh, because I say so. Yeah, that's not going to work. I can't say, hey, teller, I say the money's mine. Give it to me. Yeah, I can't do that. But if I have a legitimate piece of paper, they have to respect it.
Basically, they are created by the bank. They always just stay in the banking system.
They are not created by the bank. They're released by the Federal Reserve, but so he still hasn't got this part right. Every month or whatever, the banks do a deal with the Federal Reserve. They send old rotten cash back to get burned, and all this other kind of crap happens, and all the books are made even again. And that's when the banks are given cash to lend, the hard currency that they actually put over the counter now and then. But again, now that it's digital, it means it just stays in the vault and the digits go out. So what? They're still real digits. They're still real accountable digits that have to be able to trace them to the real asset they represent. They always have to be represented by a real asset. That means I went to a bank with the deed to my house and I gave it to the bank and said, I want a mortgage. Okay, give me some cash. I'm giving you possession of my house. That cash that I'm spending in the economy, the trail is to my house, to a real piece of stuff.
Possession of the bank. They might be on your bank statement, they might be by a MasterCard bank statement, the Walmart's bank statement, but they're always in the possession of the bank. They are always the bank's.
Totally irrelevant. It is not the bank's property. Again, it's just silly. If I have a claim that says I own my house, right? I own 90% of my house. I'm giving them my deed, okay, to borrow 10% of the value of my house. All right? So they have some insurance. But they don't own my house now. Okay? They only own 10% of it. That's their only legitimate claim, is to have their money paid back. If I pay them back their money, I get my whole house back. That's the legal contract. So don't pretend that I'm risking my ownership of my house by giving it to the bank. No, I'm not. Not if I have a contract. And again, if the bank goes bankrupt, yes, then you're going to start worrying. And you didn't have to worry when FDIC insurance was realistic, but it's not realistic anymore. So now you really do have to worry, because the fact is the bank's not going to be able to pay you the money. It's not going to have it.
I don't know what to call them. Digits.
They're not just digits. They're representations. They're symbolic pieces of paper that basically says on it, sheep, car, birds, whatever, bag of rice. That's what it says on it, technically. It is a direct link to stuff that was mortgaged to create the currency. Right,
so we're going to central bank digital currencies, which are obviously going to come. But the question is, how are they going to come? And more importantly, I've been looking at the interwebs quite a lot to see if anybody can understand it. And of course they can't, because they don't basically understand basic banking or central banking.
So this idiot thinks he understands. He understands what those $8 trillion is. So we've had this argument for years. He doesn't get it at all. He thinks that money can come out of there. He thinks that's the bank's money. No, the banks just wrote checks they never cashed. Okay? To buy assets for the federal government. The banks don't want them. The banks don't want the stupid crappy bonds they bought. They have no interest in them. They're not going to get anything for owning those stupid bonds. They're useless to them. They only did it because the government made a deal. And they clearly made a deal. There wouldn't be $8 trillion. What bank would put $8 trillion in the vault when the stock market's been going up every year for the last 10 years? Why? What idiot would say, oh, I have $1 trillion. I'll just leave it in the vault and get 0% interest, when the stock market's gone up like 10% a year on average, or whatever it is, huge amount. Okay, yes, it's only going up because we're buying the assets off of the market, but it doesn't matter why it's going up. The fact is, it's been going up. What bank would keep its assets in the vault then? I mean, it has an opportunity to make free fucking money, like double its money, and it just says, no, I'm not going to bother doubling my money. I'm not interested in being rich. Yeah, sure.
So they're expounding on, they're talking about how these central bank digital currencies will come to existence and ruin your life normally. But they're obviously completely wrong, because they're basing their information on what they think, how they think they can be put into practice, when they obviously can't, because life doesn't work that way.
Oh, they can't be put into practice because you can't just make money. You can't just print it. It has to be tied to an asset. That's what makes it make sense, is the fact that its creation has to be generated because you put a real asset in to create the monetary value out. And if you don't do that, if there's no value in, then there's no value coming out.
It's all just based on this horrible thing that people do not understand banking or central banking. Right. So we've got private bank digital currencies is what we deal with at the moment for 99% of our transactions. And the thought is, where we're up to, how can central bank digital currencies be first brought in, as in why?
Well, the simple way to do it is just to put real cash in the vault and create digital currencies representing the cash. So what? You have a dollar bill that has a serial number on it. Create a digital dollar bill that has the same serial number. What's the difference then? They just move the dollar bill around and digitally, and who cares? Doesn't mean anything. So there's no reason to do that, though, because the banks can already do that. The banks can already represent your assets with a check. And those checks would all be good if the banks weren't allowing people to put assets that have no value into the bank. And that's essentially what all these bad mortgages are, right? So even though they have deeds to houses, that won't be worth half of what was paid for them. And because the mortgages are on more than half the value of the house, the bank can't make any money if the value of the house goes down 50%. Even though they have a deed, the mortgages are so big that what they have in terms of real assets is so small that if it crashes, they're done. They need that mortgage to be paid off over 30 or 40 years for them to make their money. You think that's going to happen? You think people are going to pay these mortgages off? No.
I can think of 5 ways. Let's go for not social security. Let's say these now beer bug bonuses that come from the government. Let's always deal in dollars and vaguely America, but it's the same in the whole world. $600, $2,000, whatever it might be, could one day just be introduced as, instead of private bank digital dollars as they are now, they could be introduced as central bank digital.
And there'd be no difference. So again, this conversation is just silly. The Federal Reserve has a purpose in terms of cashing out the differences in the transactions. It's just basically saying you already did this. You already did a bunch of transactions, okay, with checks, and you're just going to neutralize the checks in one computer. One computer says what's the bottom line. How many checks went from A to B, and how many checks went from B to A, and let's figure out the total and figure out who owes who what. And that's all there is. There is no Federal Reserve digit versus a bank digit. The Federal Reserve doesn't control the digits. It just controls how much cash there is. The digits are, again, what the banks create based on what assets they've taken in. They write their checks based on what they take in. Again, they have to take in the money for them to produce. So to give money back out, they have to have some reason to believe they're going to get the money back, or they're going to take a deed in that's worth what they gave out. If I'm going to give somebody $300,000 to buy a house, they have to give me something worth $300,000. And so what they give me is a down payment in cash plus the deed to the house. So I have a pretty good chance of getting my money back. That is, if the house is really worth $300,000. Now, if the house turns out to be worth $50,000 because the economy is going to crash, well, then I'm really in trouble. Well, anyway, he'll never get to those real circumstances. And he doesn't understand what cash is. He doesn't understand how important it is not to print it.
It's a history for the whole world over hundreds of years. But that sort of thing that we can imagine. And it was the authorities' central job to maintain par between the two. As the banking digital currencies, they went digital in those days, it was just scribbled on bits of paper, to maintain the scribbled bank currency at par with the government-given chunky cash coins and notes, and of course bonds.
It just had to be at par with what the pawn shop took in. The regulation was you can't take in one TV and now send out 400 tickets for the one TV. You can't resell the TV. You can't remonetize it more than once. It's only one ticket for one TV.
Had to be maintained as fungible par amounts. That is what we will have in the future. We will have the government bonds.
Oh, it's just too silly. Nothing's going to change in the future because we've already digitized it already. So there was obviously no change. The basic function is you don't create a currency unless you have an asset to back it up. And that's the basic mechanism. And as soon as you break that by saying I'm going to make a currency and I'm not going to have any asset backing it up, that's when you're going to be in big trouble. All right. So enough of this mush. Yeah, that's enough. We've been over it. I mean, it's the same. Like I said, it just goes through the whole video saying they don't understand. He does. He doesn't understand anything.
For the moment, obviously, our private bank digits are an asset to us because we can use them at Walmart. Push not coming to shove, everything going well, you can use them at Walmart. They are a liability for the bank because they're
and they're a liability for the federal government. Again, it doesn't matter who prints the cash, whether the bank prints the cash by writing checks it shouldn't, or whether the banks print the cash by actually printing cash. Both of those won't work. And that's why the only way they've gotten away with it is they've taken all of these bad checks, this printed cash, this printed value that they put into the market, and they never cash the checks because first they don't have the money. But if anybody ever requires them to, that is if they're ever required to make these books balance, that is where people demand to have their stuff back, they're not going to have $8 trillion worth of stuff.
To transfer them to Walmart when we spend at Walmart, and we won't go into the quantitative easing at this stage. That would only confuse matters. But
that's what the whole thing is based on, though. So you won't go into quantitative easing. That's what the $8 trillion represents, and it's not easing anything. It's just inflating markets, keeping markets afloat. It's blowing up the bubbles. Keep the housing market, keep the stock market, keep them afloat, okay, by a bunch of fake activity, a bunch of fake economic activity. It's like aliens came here and spent $8 trillion of alien money, and that money just will disappear someday. It just evaporates. That's what's going to happen. $8 trillion worth of everybody's wealth is going to just disappear because it was never real.
Imagine somebody, say a retired person, that is now, things have gone on slightly, and their social security from the government is now being paid in central bank digital currency. Their old working pension is being paid in private bank digital currency. They are getting bank statements with two two lots on it. You've got your private bank digital.
It really couldn't make any difference at all. I mean, so it's just nonsense to say because the government sends you a check to your bank, puts a check in your bank, okay, that somehow the money was more real than any other money you got from the other fund, because IBM sends a check to your bank or the government sends a check to your bank. Those two banks, it doesn't make any difference. So this is just silly to think this has anything to do with the subject.
Central bank and maintain the 2% interest on your private bank.
The important part is how did the government finance paying the check? When it sent the check to the bank, does it have the assets to cover the check? Did it tax to collect the money so it can actually pay the check? Or is it just building up a bunch of debt instead of ever paying any bills? It's all on the credit card. You can't just throw the credit card away, even if it's the government. You can't just throw the credit card away because there are real interactions with real people. Real people own the debt of the credit card. And they have to tell those people, screw you, you don't get your money. Somebody has to get screwed here. There's been all this overspending that wasn't tied to any real industry, wasn't tied to any real stuff, any real wealth, and somebody's going to have to pay for all that fraud.
Digital account. Where should we go with this? Because that's probably quite enough for, certainly for the newcomers. Where I'd like to point out is between the start and the end of this. For central banks.
So he's talking to some little private group somewhere, and every once in a while he makes a video. I don't understand, he's having some little private conversation somewhere, in text, I guess, and then he decides to make a video every now and then. The whole thing doesn't make any sense at all.
To get the authority to go forward with this, it's obviously got to come from central government. So what we are effectively going to be having are central government digital currencies.
Again, it just doesn't matter. Digital, real, it doesn't matter. What only part that matters is there an asset backing it up?
They will be marketed probably as central bank digital currencies, but when it comes down to it, they will be central government digital currencies. And the same thing will apply, as applies to private bank digital currencies, that the currency will always and ever be in the possession of the central government. It will never.
No, it's just silly. So again, it's your claim. The claim is the deed is the object. So in some way, he's saying as soon as you write ownership of my house on a piece of paper and say deed to my house, that somehow the piece of paper isn't a contract and it doesn't mean anything. And as long as you're sitting in your house, it doesn't matter that you sold your house to somebody with a piece of paper. No, the piece of paper matters. The contracts are valid. So this pretending that this is all some sort of the banker's money, no. They're all contracts. None of that's going to be the hard part to sort out. Who's owed the money won't be the problem. The problem is where do you get the money?
But be yours. Ever be yours. You'll get a statement saying you've got so many of them that they'll never be yours. You can transfer them to Walmart, and Walmart will never own them. They will be temporarily holding them for the government. All digits will always be government digits, as all digits are now private bank digits.
That just doesn't mean anything. There's contracts. It's all just about contracts. And to say one contract is better than another contract is better than another contract is just bullshit. They're all what it says on its face. And the real game is just tracing it to the stuff and who wrote the contract and finding out, who was the crook, who wrote the bad paper.
That's enough to be going on with. Any more expansion or depth, I think, would be too much at this stage. Okay, thanks, bye.
Yeah, whatever. Yeah, not even close. Anyway. So enough. I've been over it so many because I've done other videos where I go into more detail, but this is you just follow the stuff. This real value is all you're writing paper for. Is real value. Every dollar bill represents people on the line fixing the electricity thing. It represents labor, work, sacrifice, hardship, all that kind of stuff. It's built into it. That's what it's made of. It's value. It's a piece of value, right? And again, if you print it, okay, then you're diminishing the value, just obviously, because there's no work, no productivity, no anything tied to the creation of the value. So The government has been able to increase how much cash there is in circulation as the productivity of the economy increases. But those lines don't match anymore. The economy is not producing. It's not making more value. It's just making more wealth. It's making more claims that I own somebody's debt, but it's not making any value. And that's the same thing it did in 29 crash. The 29 crash was created out of the fact that there was so much of this debt that everybody was buying everything on time, but they had no way of paying any of it back. And so all these people thought they were really rich because they're making all this money, renting to the poor. But there was no practicality to it. There was no sense to it. None of it could be actually realized as a gimmick for making money. And so then all of a sudden, all of this fake wealth, when you reduce the economy to what it really was worth, it wasn't worth very much. The working economy wasn't nearly productive enough to justify what they had claimed it was worth. Till the next time and such. So forth and whatnot. No, this has been a DoNotGod video presentation and such.